Hello, everyone. This is the FANAC Fan History Zoom series, and this one is on researching and saving science fiction fan history. Our participants are Rob Hansen, who has done numerous books and other material and has his own website on British fandom. Mark Olson, who is the primary editor of Fancyclopedia 3, and Andy Hooper, who has been writing about fan history in fanzines for years and years. And I am Joe Siclari, the chairman of the Fan History Project, but I haven't written a lot of fan history. My primary goal has been to preserve it on FANAC Fan.org, where you can find many original materials for yourselves to read and do research.
And I'll offer one addendum to your introduction to me. I have written a lot on fan history, but I think that my presence here is probably due to the fact that I am the only huckster that I know of in fandom who specializes entirely in selling old fanzines. That's pretty much all I do. So I have a unique perspective in that I have been flogging them on eBay for the last 6 years. I also approach fan history as a commercial venture as well. So
right, but your research in early first fandom, especially the first Worldcon, it's been extraordinary.
Right. But I also have been, I then, for the last 6 years, my primary fan history research activity has been describing things for the purpose of auctioning them. So I essentially, my job every day is to read old fanzines.
Oh, that's so terrible.
Well, I mean, I feel I'm sort of unique. I don't know anybody else who's really managed to monetize their fan activity in exactly this way. So I'm sure someone out there will, there's someone that I don't know of in the past who did this, but
Pete Balistreri said he spent 2 years getting paid to read fanzines, but he's with Iowa University. But let us get to some of our other people. If you would each if you tell us how you got started in fandom and then how you got interested in the fan history. I think that's should be an interesting subject for each of us. Rob, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure, why not? My first convention was in 1975, an EasterCon. As with most people, I saw it advertised in an SF magazine, in my case, Science Fiction Monthly. Got involved in fandom slowly but surely over the next couple of years. And I got curious as to how long this stuff had been going on. And so from Ken Slater's Phantasm Medway, I bought a copy of All Our Yesterdays, Harry Warner Jr., which whetted my appetite. And I thought, well, where's the history of British fandom? Because obviously he covered bits and pieces of it, but there was no history. So I looked around and, there wasn't any history. As Peter Weston actually wrote in the introduction to then, he had the same thought himself. And he said you couldn't find the old fanzines even to investigate into. And then, so I started putting together what I could from secondary sources, first of all, to produce initially an article that wasn't published, that then expanded slightly and became The Story So Far, which was a small booklet put out for the 1989 convention. And it was chatting to Vince Clarke after that, saying, well, it's a shame I didn't have the sources for anything bigger than this. And he kind of put up his hand and said, well, actually, he said, I've got fanzines going back to the 1930s, which is how it all started. And then I seriously got into researching the fan history, and I put out then, first of all, as a part work, if you like, 4 fanzines over the course of about 5 years, because there was quite a bit of digging and investigating. And I couldn't have done it without Vince Clarke, obviously, because he did a lot of that digging himself. And that was then. And then then took the form of an online version. And eventually in 2016, Dave Langford decided it would be a good idea to put this out as a book. And in 2016, it came out as a book. Now, one thing about it is whenever you write something like this that's that big, there's going to be a few errors creep in. So therefore, you have to have a errata. And there is an errata that's kept up to date on Dave's website. But what you should all do, all of those who brought it earlier, is print that errata off, stick it in the front of the book. And then if you then take each page number and put a red dot next to the page number, you'll then know when you've got to refer back to the errata. So that's something I'd advise to all of you. And that's that got me up to that point. And then I assume we want to get into the other stuff I do with Dave a bit later on. But that's initially how I got started in all that.
Okay, your reference to the non-published first article, I think I still have that someplace in the garage.
Right, but it's not.
If you ever want to read it again, see what the difference was.
No, throw it away.
Was it supposed to go on a Fan Historica?
Yes, it was when Fan Historica stopped.
Yeah, exactly.
And by the time I did another one, he had already published it.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, you're next on my screen.
Okay. Well, I got involved in fandom in when I went to Minicon 1, and I think it was '68. And then was in a club and convention fandom for many, many years in grad school. And then when I moved to the Boston area for work, I got involved in NESFA and stayed really in club and convention fandom until after sometime in the early mid 90s, I started getting much more interested in fan history. And I particularly piqued by a very interesting conversation I had with Rich Lynch 20, 30 years ago, when he was working on a follow-up to Harry Warner. And he was complaining that the task was impossible, that their fandom had just expanded so much that it was impossible to produce a comprehensive history of a decade, which was too bad, but at the time, it's something I kept coming back to, trying to think of how you could do fan history in an era where fandom had grown beyond the scope of a Harry Warner. And following up that has been sort of the interest of the last 15, 20 years.
Okay. Andy, how did you get started in the fan history portion?
I got involved in fandom as a high school student, and my first convention was in 1978. It stuns me that I've only been in fandom 3 years less than Rob. I kind of thought you came into fandom like by 1970.
No,
so
I just look very old. I've had a hard life.
I've learned something right away here. But I was involved in a Star Trek club in my high school, and there was a local convention that was coalescing in Madison, Wisconsin, where I grew up. And it was called WisCon. And I attended the second WisCon as a gopher. And that was pretty much the end for me. I got involved in fanzine publishing because that was one of the major club activities in Madison. They did a fanzine called Janus that later became Aurora. And we just had a program talking about that last time. In the Feminism in the 1970s panel. And so I think my first fanzine experiences were collating issues of Aurora, walking around a big dining room table with people. And everyone seemed to be having such a great time and have such an enormous command of all the lore of science fiction that I was seduced immediately and just wanted to hang around and listen to those people as much as possible. I think I became interested in fan history specifically when Jean Gamol, who was one of my mentors in Madison fandom, became interested in standing for the Transatlantic Fan Fund. And she presented a program on Bob Shaw at one of our monthly kind of formalized meetings. And I just was fascinated. I thought it was really funny writing, as anyone would, and just wanted to follow up and learn about TAF and the wheels of if, and suddenly, you know, huge doors opened up by starting to read British fanzines. So, and then we worked together to bring Chuck Harris to Minicon in 1988, I think. Not Minicon, to Corflu, to the first Minneapolis Corflu. And we did a project called the Chuck Harris Appreciation Society magazine. And so that was my first experience with going and finding articles by people in old fanzines. And I just never stopped ever since, basically.
Okay, well, I got started, and the way I got started almost got me kicked out of college. I got into a bit of a discussion with Fari Ackerman at the 1972 Worldcon. I had been in fandom for a while, but never gotten to a Worldcon until then. And there was a great auction, which I was trying to get some fanzines, and Fari kept bidding on some of these, saying that he had written for that zine. When I complained about that at dinner later that night with some friends, Elaine Wojciechowski said she had some duplicate fanzines she could send me. I think I've told this story multiple times, but you're stuck with it once more. The week after I got back, there was a carton or two of fanzines by my door of my apartment. A couple of days later, there were a couple more boxes. Eventually, she sent me 17 cartons of fanzines, for which I found myself buried in and reading, and they were much better than reading my college textbooks. So I read and I read, and these fanzines went back at least to the 1940s, because there were a couple of parts of, no, just one part of Ah Sweet Idiocy. And there was Yerke's memoir and a variety of things, a whole mishmash. And I started trying to put them together and wanted to find out more. And so I kept collecting and collecting, and still do. And my first project, really, to get this out was to do FANHistorica with Gary Farber for the first issue. And we distributed that in 1976 at a non-con, because we couldn't get to Australia. So that was my first project. But what was your first fan history effort that you worked on with other fans? Andy, you've given us a little bit of a insight into that, but is there anything else that you were working on particularly?
Yeah, see, that was one of the hardest questions for me to answer when we were looking at the Précis questions beforehand, trying to figure out what we were going to talk about. It's like, I'm just trying to remember how I became involved in working on fan history, and it's just it's so long ago that I think it was that Chuck Harris project was part of it. But then oh God, Fanthologies, working on Fanthology 1987, in order to present, the opportunity came up, we should do a Fanthology. And I said, oh, of course we should. And then I said, what is a Fanthology? And had to go and read a whole bunch of Fanthologies assembled by people like Victoria Vane and the Nielsen Haydens, and Mike Gleyer's 1984 Fanthology. And so I think that may have been the first thing that I got involved with where we were doing things together with other people. But it's interesting that I think of that as being fan history, but it's like you're making fan history. You're creating a source readings for people that will want to know about what a year was like sometime in the future. So I don't know, I think I sort of became involved in documenting the present as much as anything else before I began really interested in researching the past.
Well, you were, as you said, creating a document for fan history. Rob, you've done fanthologies as well.
Yeah, well, in essence, that's what these books are. They're collections, for the most part, of existing fan articles. Because I realized at some point that in actual fact, you could put together fan histories where, as long as you had enough material, the people themselves could tell the story if you arranged it correctly. Hence Pixelstrasse, which covered 6 years in the middle of the 1940s Los Angeles fandom, and of course Homefront, which is all about the wartime UK fans actually on the home front, because obviously some of them were abroad in that. Insofar as I can, I also use public sources. I mean, in the case of Pixelstrasse, had I been over there in the US, a couple of things I would have done were, one, I would have checked where the clubhouse was specifically. And the reason I ask this is because Francis Laney had his Fran shack about a mile away from the Bixel Street club room, and his Fran shack used to be owned by a Japanese business before they were all interned. And given that the property was a mile away and apparently was used to be a beauty parlor and wasn't anymore, the suspicion arises, was this also once a Japanese business whose owners were interred? That's the kind of thing I would have investigated back then. And similarly, there's the case of Sam Russell, who was spying on Lasphus for the FBI. Again, if I was over there, I would have done a Freedom of Information request just to find out what they wrote about Lasphus. I mean, I just probably not as interesting as one would hope, but these are the things it's worth looking at. And even something as simple as going into public records and seeing if there were any drawings and plans of that property. Because again, we've got no actual pictures of it, which is a bit irritating. We've got some descriptions of it on the inside, so that that's the kind of thing. So using public sources is not a bad idea. I mean, again, when I first started researching then, I was relying on accounts by people who were around then. And one of those accounts was by our first fan from our first fan group, which was Walter Gillings. And all the accounts he'd ever written said it began in 1931, and its business was recorded in the Ilford Recorder. And given that I don't live that far from Ilford, I went to the local library where they had the microfilms of this, went all the way through the 1931 records, no sign at all of the Ilford Science Literary Circle. So I thought, he's got the date wrong, yeah, hasn't I? So I went, fortunately, I went in the right direction. I went back to 1930, and lo and behold, there they all were. So in other words, had I not done that, we would have had it that, oh, well, this group started in 1931, purely because Walter Gillings misremembered. So if you can check in the public records, if there are public records to be checked, it's always very useful.
Okay, Mark, what were some of your projects that you've been working on besides Fancyclopedia?
Well, Fancyclopedia really was the first significant fan history project I worked on, so, and still am. As I say, I came to fan history as a interest later, I think, than the rest of you.
Right. A little bit of background on the on Fancyclopedia 3. It originally was supposed to be done by the Lasphus and Skiffy when Dick Eney was the fan guest of honor. Yeah. FANAC arranged, a decade or more later to start working on the project. Mark was the person who kicked off our thought about doing the Fan History Project. Actually, at one of our meetings after MagicCon, he gave me a kick in the butt and said, come up with a project that we need to, that we can do and keep on doing and use some of the surplus funds from MagicCon. And that's what we used to start the project and get everything going, and has funded us for this length of time, along with some donations from a number of people. So
quite a few people, actually.
Yeah. And so he had, someplace I just lost the screen, and
What?
I don't know if you guys can still see me.
Yeah,
yeah.
There we
still
are.
here.
Yeah, no problem. You probably
Okay.
minimized yourself.
All right. Anyway, he did kick me in the ass, like I said, and gave me to come up with a project, which a number of other people really have done a lot of the tough technical work on and making our archive work. Okay. There are just so many different kinds of questions that we can ask on this, but one that I did want to bring up is, who do you think are our previous fan historians that people should actually try to find additional work by and read? Mark, you want to start with this one?
Wow. Well, I'm not sure I've got any great insights. You know, there's the classics, of course. You know, Moskowitz and Warner. There's Dick Eney did a considerable amount of research in his work, though I must admit I have not yet had a chance to read through what of his zines we've got up on FANAC. You know, in terms of more contemporary history, the thing that stands out for me is Mimosa, which had an amazing series of articles by people about the. Yeah, I think what I particularly liked about those was they were both interesting and well written as a rule, which I think helped a whole lot there.
Right.
Okay, Rob?
Thinking about it, yeah, it's there are people who wrote fan history who haven't been collected, and that's the kind of, if you like, the low-hanging fruit who should be collected. Like, for instance, Red Boggs wrote a serial history of the Minneapolis Fantasy Society. It was serialized in Ruth Berman's Neolithic. As far as I can tell, only one episode of that is actually on fanac.org at the moment. So that might be something specifically pursuing with Ruth, if you could, because that definitely should be collected. Because if you collect that, and you also look at the MFS Bulletin and the Fantasite, and extract material from that, put all that together, you've got another chunk of fan history. You've probably got a fan history book in there. So these are the things, you know, you need to look at. And again, as Mark was saying, Mimosa had a lot of good stuff in it, and its UK equivalent over here, Peter Weston's Relapse, had some great stuff in it as well.
Yes.
So,
right.
So they're sources that actually exist though. So I mean, I regard Peter in his later years as being a fan historian as well, because he did a lot of research work. He also did something really crucial, is he went around with his scanner, because he knows, you know, he's been in fandom long enough that he knew a lot of fans from his generation and earlier generations, and he went around with his scanner scanning their photograph albums, because as he said, these are the things that just kind of tend to get thrown away when people die. And so the reason I've got such a great archive of UK and in fact US photos, which I've not revealed all of these yet to people, is because he went round and he got it all. I mean, in the case of say people like Ted Carnell, he was exchanging photographs with American fans back in the 30s and 40s. So there's some great stuff there.
Andy, got anything else?
Well, Jack Speer invented fan history, so it's worth recognizing him. The Pt1 and up to now. Let's see. I mean, Warner was important to me, absolutely. Warner is misunderstood. I don't think that he meant to be a historian. I think he meant to be a reporter, which is what he was trained for. And he essentially presented a series of columns in a book form.
Right.
So they are lacking in coherent narrative.
Exactly.
But they're profoundly valuable books. For me personally, Robert Lichtman was always my personal source for anything I wanted to know about fan history. I just had to publish my erroneous opinion about it, and Robert would immediately correct me. So that I miss him profoundly. I don't have anyone like that right now who's my backstop and keeps me from making a fool of myself. And it's already caused me trouble because I apparently misquoted somebody's graduate thesis in Australia. So
horror.
He sent me two chiding notes suggesting I learn to proofread. And I felt like saying, well, sir, it's too late, I think, at this point. Oh, there, I've lost the thread.
Yeah, in regard to,
I also find, I think Forey Ackerman was an enormous fan historical source for a number of different fandoms. The last couple of years, I've been working on a project to document the work and lives of costumed horror movie hosts on American television, but also in Australia and in Canada. It's amazing how huge Forey's shadow is in horror fandom, and how much material, I mean, how much of what we know about any of these people is thanks to what he published about them in Famous Monsters 50 years ago.
Well, Forey was also involved in a lot of different things, some of which don't really interact with our fandom, but for which he always was very well known. Some of which I'm sure he didn't want to be known in, but two people I think we should mention that were documenting and trying to improve fan history were Lee Hoffman and Terry Carr.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Both of whom did a number of reprint things. And Lee, after I got in touch with her in the 70s, helped guide me through all kinds of things back and forth. You know, she had been involved with so many different interesting people. She was always a good source of contacts and
she also published the first fan history zine, of course, Fan History.
Well, she did. It wasn't actually the first. There were a couple of other zines before that published some different things. And of course, Terry did his Entropy reprints.
Yep.
But those were, well, actually, you know, a follow-up to Walt Willis's Toto, which he inserted into hyphen at various times. What is your current fan history project? Let's jump right to those because it is important to see what we're looking at now and we think is the primary goals to get done in the near future. Mark, is there any specific area of Fancyclopedia that you and the people working with you are focusing on and adding to these days?
Adding to everywhere. Nothing. We don't have any. I don't think there's any areas of focus. One thing that's I think been really nice is Leah Smith, Laurie Mann, and B. Ostrovsky are all really dig into it researchers and have been coming up with a lot of detail about early fans, when they were born, when they died, who they were related to, making connections that we didn't have before. This has been, I think, extremely useful. And you know, I've always seen Fancyclopedia, one of its roles is to basically provide the bedrock of facts that histories can be written with.
Yeah.
And so getting this stuff tied down and documenting where it came from is, I think, fabulous.
And it occurs to me another person that deserves a lot of credit for Fancyclopedia is the late Rich Brown.
Yes.
Who spent basically the last two and a half years of his life solely writing Dr. Gaffia articles for what became Fancyclopedia 3.
On the credit line, Jim Corrin also, he was the one who actually put Fancy 2 into a wiki, which was the essential first step in creating F3.
Mm-hmm. Rob?
Sorry, what were we?
What are you doing now?
What are you doing now? What are you working on now? What's the current?
Yeah, as you were aware, I'm always working on an ebook of some sort or other with Dave Langford. The current one, which I've been beavering away at for a while now, will be UK Conventions, Volume 1, 1937 to 1951. So I'm basically collating what we know about those conventions in terms of such reports that are available. Obviously, very few about the early ones, but we're getting them together. The programs were known, and also, insofar as I can determine, who was at the early ones, because obviously they didn't print lists of attendees. So it's a question of getting all that together at the moment. So needless to say, the first volume is the one it's a bit hardest to scrape stuff together from, because the early conventions weren't covered as much as later conventions. But yeah, so that volume's not far away from going to Dave to turn it from the stuff I send to him into something resembling a book, which will be coming, I hope, in the next, 2 or 3 weeks with a bit of luck. We'll see.
Okay. Andy asked me a question earlier about what we were putting on FanHistory. FANAC. Like the material we did for FanHistory, we were gathering material to just try to reprint material. And when we originally started this, I created a list of 100 or so, 150 fanzines that I considered a core list, most of which I had read over the years. Not necessarily every issue, because I didn't have every issue, but they were basic fanzines that people often referred to, ranging from Quandary and Hyphen to Yandro, and the list I believe Edie has put online. We started focusing on those. I shared zines with other people and asked them to scan them, and I scanned them myself. And recently we realized we had about 85+% of those now online. And so we started opening up to other people making suggestions and scanning zines. And several people suggested that we put on club zines and other things. And we've been adding some of those and trying to be as representative as we can. We'd love to finish out the core list. But one of the things I think you're going to find in the survey we do this summer, we've been doing a survey each year, is ask people for other core type fanzines that they think we should be preserving, and get those online. We're still working and creating that list ourselves, but we'd like to get that info from other people. And when they do give it to us, we hunt for those zines, both through my collection and by asking people for them. So that is where we're going to be going in with FANAC and the archives.
One of the points, just an additional comment here, one of the points that I think is really crucial, and we're at a point here where we haven't got much longer to do it, is to document as much as possible of fandom. Unfortunately, I kind of wish we'd started this 20 years earlier so we could have gotten these Zooms. Of course, it wasn't possible then with the first fandom, with the founders and the creators of fandom. I would really rather listen to them than us, but that's not going to happen. But fanzines are fragile, and they won't ever disappear, but they're going to become less and less available, whether they disappear into garbage bins or university archives. They become unavailable, and I think getting them scanned out there is critical. Similarly, the Confubs project, a related project on FANAC that I'm mostly pushing, is collecting and scanning convention publications. And, that's all material which is terribly ephemeral, but there's a lot of fan history in them. And
yep, definitely.
Including something I really haven't thought about, but there's an enormous number of appreciations of people written by other people in fandom. And they were basically unavailable. Still mostly are, since most of them are nowhere yet. but you know, I've scanned a lot of my dupes, and Ben Yellow and Jean Gamol both made big contributions to it. You know, we're getting there.
When you're doing your research, what aspects of it most entice you? How do you do it? But what is it that keeps you going? Because this can be some considerable drudge work.
Yep.
Rob?
It's well, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, when I did then, remember, there was no history. So first of all, I needed to establish a timeline, figure out what happened, and then I could move out from that to kind of investigate. So I started off with the bibliographies that there were and the newszines. The bibliographies, because that basically gave me a timeline. And again, because I wasn't there, I didn't know what was significant and what wasn't. But by reading the contemporary newszines, you get a sense of what was important to the fans at the time. And so that gave me, if you like, a skeleton that I was then able to build on. So that, in terms of then, that was what I was doing there. But in something like, say, Bixelstrasse, which, remember, this is another fan. This is another country as well. What happened there was that kind of grew outwards a different way, in that it started off in 2019 with me reading something about Tigrina, who was also known as Lisa Ben, and was obviously Edith Ede. And it was to do with, there were illustrations being written of her that ignored the Tigrina part of her history. So I thought I ought to do something about this. So I kind of researched it basically on FANAC.org, wrote an article, and then when I did that, I got interested in all the other people around. So I started, doing more and more of this, and it built up in a whole list of profiles that are still on my website. And I eventually thought, I've got the basis here for a book. And so therefore, again, this was me getting interested in the specific period, the specific people in that 6-year period, basically not the entirety of Los Angeles fandom, just the Pixel Street era. And so I got interested in that, kept digging into it, and eventually basically the ebook there kind of coalesced more than anything else, as opposed to then, which was rather more deliberate. So just depending on what the project is, it can be quite different.
Andy, you were doing research on the people who attended the first Worldcon.
Yeah, I've been working on a book about the first Worldcon for a long time, and it's been the various chapters have all been published in other people's fanzines as we go along. There's a bunch of them that were in Robert Lichtman's Trapdoor, and the most recent one appeared in Jerry and Suzel's Little Brook. It'll eventually be collected, but all of the stuff that I've come up with so far can be read. And the next one is supposed to be about Wollheim's Worldcon, and specifically about the 6 Futurians who were excluded at the door to the hall by James Tarossi, and why. But along the process of writing these stories about individual people's experience, I just became fascinated with the idea of, could we actually document every single person who was at the con? I was somewhat inspired by the fact that Denver did something like this before their most recent Worldcon. They tried to document all the people who attended the first Denver Worldcon in 1941. So that's where I got the idea. And the first half of it was published in the last issue of Chunga that was published to date, and hopefully the second half will be coming out sometime before the end of 2023. So that's been fascinating. And to the previous question, we did come up at some point with the note that the genealogy resources are really valuable in sort of fact-checking things that people write in fanzines. One of the things that I did last year, as I was working on a project in response to Kim Hewitt, who was writing about the origins of the Fan Activity Awards, an attempt to create the Fan Awards in the early 1960s by a fan named George C. Willick, who excited much hilarity by suggesting that the award take the form of a nude woman holding a dagger in each hand, which may have been why Kim wanted to pursue this in the first place. Kim had not been able to find much about George Willich after the point that he gaffiated right around the time of the '62 Worldcon, and he thought that he had essentially left fandom in shame. And I found out by just going and checking into his family tree on Ancestry.com that he got his girlfriend pregnant and he had to go back home to Indiana and get a job. And basically that was why he dropped out of active fandom, but he didn't really gaffiate. He continued to be a reader. He carried on with local fans for the rest of his life, basically, but he disappeared from what fandom thinks of as the written record. So that's, I've just been doing a lot to try and use ancillary sources to fact check things that fans offer. And then I had a couple other notes. It's really hard. There's been great stuff in the chat through all this, but it's really hard to multitask and read the chat and talk at the same time. But Lori, I did do Bill Cardilli a couple of years ago and did a profile of all of Pittsburgh's horror hosts. And in fact, I advanced the theory that Pittsburgh is the horror capital of America. So if you're interested in reading about that, it's in a fanzine called Captain Flashback that appears on efanzines.com on Bill Byrne's website. And if you're interested in fan history, there's people writing about fan history, putting stuff up pretty much every month. So that's another resource we haven't mentioned here. I assume it's something that everyone here is familiar with, but so
hopefully everyone is. Earl Kemp did a lot of his background on a fanzine that's available on eFanzines. Mark, can you address this as well?
No.
Okay.
No, we've lost the thread here because I was
exactly what I'm trying to
very
say.
disorganized in my answer. I'm sorry.
I think we were talking about Pittsburgh, and then.
Well, actually, I was asking about I mentioned that some of this can take a lot of drudge work, and how you would be putting your material together and how you worked on it.
Well, I could answer that, actually. It took a while to figure it out, but I finally realized that I found a way finally of sublimating my collector's instinct. Instead of filling the house with stuff, I'm filling databases with stuff. It's almost as satisfying and a lot easier.
It takes up a lot less room.
Yes.
It does that. I wish I could figure out how to do that with the fanzines. The work that we've been doing, we've mentioned a number of resources, our own websites, of course, and fanzines, but what other resources are you using? You mentioned Rob mentioned public information. We mentioned genealogy. Oh, let me just get a little bit of a sidetrack here. I have found that people doing genealogy work have actually gotten in touch with us to ask us if we had additional information about members of their family that they knew very, very slightly. One guy asked me about Koenig's Reader and Collector, and I found some additional copies to send him. And he was so pleased with this, he wrote, dug into more information about his uncle who had died, and ended up including him into the family genealogical history. And a couple of years later, he sent me a copy to show that the work we had done had actually helped him.
Yeah.
Have any of you heard from the guy who was trying to prove that his relative was the Zodiac killer?
No.
No, I haven't heard
There
that.
are apparently 2 members of Los Angeles fandom who it has been suggested might have been a good candidate for the Zodiac, and I shouldn't have brought this up because I don't remember who they are. But someone contacted me a couple of years ago looking for fanzines by an obscure LA area fan who'd been involved in FAPA in the mid-1970s. And his ultimate goal was he was trying to prove or disprove whether or not this relative of his could have been the Zodiac killer.
Wow.
Was he pro or con on this?
I think he was sort of pro. He was sort of pro-lurid association in general. But I thought it seemed tenuous.
Right.
Yeah.
An interesting thing that came up, what was it, must be about 12 years ago now, was when we went looking for Warren Fitzgerald, who you may recall was the guy who hosted in his apartment in Harlem the early meetings of the Scienceers. We were curious as what we could find out in the public records. Well, rather it was people in America that were curious about it. I just kind of got dialed in on it. And we have 2 descriptions of him in fan history. One from Ackerman, no, not Ackerman, Moskowitz, who calls him Jim, and the other one from somebody else whose name I've forgotten. And we have those 2 descriptions, and they both describe him as a light-skinned black man, right? So, and it's been an article of faith that one of the very first fans was in fact this black guy. So people started looking into the public record and discovered something rather interesting, which was that in a census made when he was 5 years old, he's listed as white, and various jobs he had throughout his life at a time when there were black people were barred from having those jobs, he got. And so this raised a certain amount of puzzlement. And so 2 possibilities: either 1, he was actually white, or 2, he was passing as white. But of course, none of us knew what he looked like, so we just kind of had to accept, well, okay, the public record is the public record.
There's a third possibility, which is that he was of mixed race.
Right.
And that he acknowledged the half that was more useful for him at the time.
Right. But what happened, as I say, was this. I brought this up because we're talking about people getting in touch with you. Somebody got in touch with us a while back, who basically was investigating that family because they were related to that family. And so we mentioned this to her about this controversy, and she sent a photograph through. The only photograph I know of Warren Fitzgerald, and indeed he certainly looks black to me. But again, dark skin, I don't know. But so that added one more thing to the mystery. So. I suspect from this he was probably passing. Except
cool though. I wasn't aware that a photo had been found. That's really fun.
Yeah, well, I have a copy of it, but I don't know that I'm necessarily supposed to share it because it was sent by a relative, not necessarily to share. But I mean, But anyway, so lost me thread a bit there. Oh yeah. Anyway, so we have this bit of a mystery, so we don't know what's what. But I suspect it's okay to say he was passing. But what it was, if at the age of 5 he was listed on a census as white, that was his parents put that down. So I suspect that was either his mother or his father did that. But I think you're probably right, Andy. Looking at the picture, he certainly looked mixed race to me. So, but then again, a mystery. I mean, the racial politics of the period there all makes it fairly murky.
So
and the other thing,
a few weeks ago, we were contacted by Sally Amsbury, who is the daughter of Clifton Amsbury, who was one of the 2 earliest members of the East Bay Club, which the other member, Aubrey McDermott, claimed was the first club. The interesting thing is McDermott's claims have been viewed with some skepticism.
They've been a bit, yeah.
But interestingly, Sally recalls her father saying that he joined it when he was 18. And that does in fact support McDermott's claims.
Did McDermott fight in Spain?
No, Amesbury did.
Oh, that's okay. All right. Somebody did.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other person who contacted me was the illegitimate son who she gave up for adoption of Lisa Canisa, a British fan over here, who obviously I had no idea this guy even existed. But he gave us some details of her background that we didn't know at all, which was that one, she was born in Poland, and her real name was Isabel something unpronounceable in Polish, and that her father was killed by the NKVD And at the age of 5, she was actually in a labor camp with her mother.
Wow.
So, these are all things where you think, holy hell, this is stuff that, we wouldn't have known otherwise. But so you do get, as you say, you do get inquiries from people just looking at members of their family, and they do kind of find you sometimes.
I have sold fanzines to a number of people who then came back and said, oh, this is my father's work. I'm so grateful to get it. And I feel, I always feel, goodness, if I had known, and I always try to find some extras to throw in for them.
Oh yeah.
But I've been in contact with Lynn Hickman's son, Ed Cox's son. Just recently, Roscoe Wright's son reached out to me from Oregon, and I sold him a copy of some Yusufansos that you sent me, Joe. So yeah, so this is we're doing good work here.
You can fill in family history. Most recently with me, it was Nick Youd, son of Sam Youd, who basically keeps his father's work in print anyway. But when I put together Homefront, I actually reprinted a lot of articles by his father from 1930s and 40s fanzines that his father no longer had and he'd never read, including in one case an account of the VJ weekend that included the account of his mother and father's very first meeting. So he was quite taken by that. So yeah, it's cool to be able to do that stuff, although it's incidental to what we do.
I think it would be an excellent topic for a future program here if we could contact some of these kids of well-known fanzine publishers and active fans and see if they would like to participate in a discussion like this about what they remember. Some know a lot and some don't know much.
And others don't care, but yeah. So.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah.
Graham West. I mean, one of my great, I'd like to meet Graham West, frankly. I've just been really impressed by his art, and I've been sending him correspondence that his dad sent to us at Chunga, and he's really been enjoying reading them. So.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, he contacted me a while back for a photograph of his father he wanted, and I was able to send it to him. So that's cool again, as you say, because we got these photographs in some cases that they don't have. So
I follow him on Facebook. He's a very talented artist.
Right.
It's always nice to be able to find that you've gotten something to someone who really does appreciate it.
Oh yeah.
Like a family member who had lost touch or something like that. I'm not just talking about researchers who have either an academic or a fanish interest, but somebody who has got a personal interest. And,
right.
we do get notes on that type of thing as well.